Or do I have to click to say I accept? No, we don't have to do that anymore. Do we have to click something saying we accept the recording? No,
I guess not.
I guess not anymore. Okay. Well, I'm Terry Bouricius, and normally when I give presentations, I spend a good chunk talking about the benefits of sortition, deliberative democracy, diversity of groups, and I'm going to leave all that out because my audience here are people who have already been convinced of all those things and have been many of you have been working on it for years. So this book I've been working on, it's not actually 100% done, but I've been releasing it on Substack. That's what my focus is. But first, I just want to say a few things about myself. I refer to myself jokingly and seriously as a recovering politician. I was a lawmaker for 20 years. I was elected back in the 1980s with Bernie Sanders when he was elected mayor of Burlington. I was elected to the city council as a colleague. Then I spent a decade in the city council, another decade as a state lawmaker in the Vermont House of Representatives. And then I spent another decade working on election reform nationally, going around basically as a lobbyist advocating for proportional representation, voting reforms, and so on. And it was in that role where I prepared testimony for the British Columbia Citizens Assembly that was formed to look at reforming their voting method in that province in Canada. And I gave the testimony and I was very happy with what I had said. But by the end of the entire process, I had this moment of revelation. It's like, wait a second, these 150 people, this is what democracy looks like. This is it. And ever since then, 2005 or so, the bulk of my political work has shifted to working on issues of sortition, the jury model of democracy. So a lot of people who have worked on sortition still don't necessarily know much about the history of democracy and elections, or much about the failings of elections. For a lot of activists, this is an add-on. It's to increase citizen participation, but the assumption continues, well, of course, we're going to have democracy, which is elections, and this is a good addition. And the thrust of my book is that actually that's not the end point that we should be aiming for, not to add sortition, but to supplant elections. So first, I often start by talking about the history. Most people today, of course, equate democracy means elections. In any news article you read, the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, all over the place, you'll see the equating of democracy means elections. But since the word was first coined in ancient Greece, elections were considered a system of oligarchy, empowering an elite to govern the masses, while sortition was essential to have democracy. Aristotle famously said in his Politics, the appointment of magistrates by lot is thought to be democratic, the election of them oligarchical. This understanding persisted for thousands of years through the Enlightenment. Rousseau, the leaders of the American and French revolutions understood that democracy required sortition, lottery selection, and an aristocracy required elections. A lot of people don't realize that the founders and framers of the American Republic and the French Revolution were all anti-democrats. None of them, or hardly any of them, favored democracy. Democracy they equated with mob rule. They favored rule by the, quote, natural aristocracy, is what James Madison framed it as. They were opposed to hereditary aristocracy, but they, who were not hereditary aristocrats, thought that people like them should be in charge. Benjamin Rush, who was one of the signers of the US Declaration of Independence, noted that while power may derive from the people, they, and this is a quote, possess it only on the days of their elections. After this, it is the property of their rulers, nor can they exercise or resume it unless it be abused. Joshua Miller wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Democracy in Early America, 1630 to 1789. And this is a good quote from his book. The Federalists, the advocates of the Constitution, rendered the democratic vocabulary of popular sovereignty harmless by invoking a fictitious people who could never meet, never deliberate, never take action. The body politic became a ghost. Once the Federalists had conjured an imaginary people who could not challenge the power of the national government, they became bold in declaring that the people had the right to decide, to act, and even to overthrow the government whenever they chose to do so. The leaders of the American Revolution believed in elite rule with the presumed quote-unquote consent of the people, which was never actually assessed. Rather than, they did not believe in popular self-rule. Madison wrote in the Federalist Paper number 63 that the new republic should be governed with, quote, the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity, unquote. There was one fellow, Robert Yates, who was at the Constitutional Convention, and he wrote what are referred to as the notes of the secret debates of the Federal Convention of 1787. And he quoted all kinds of people there, and one of them was Madison. And he quoted Madison saying of the structure of the proposed US Senate, the Senate, quote, ought to be constituted as to protect the minority of opulent against the majority, unquote. So it wasn't until early in the 19th century that the meaning of the word democracy began to change to the meaning elections, with the redefinition firmed up by Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. So today, almost nobody knows that the form of government in France and the United States was designed to be an alternative to democracy. In French, I will quote the president of the National Assembly, Boissy d'Anglas, who during the Revolution, in a speech he gave that summarized his elite vision of the new French Republic. Quote, we should be governed by the best among us. The best are the most highly educated and those with the greatest interest in upholding the laws. Save for the rarest exceptions, you will only find such men among those who, by reason of their owning property, are devoted to the land in which it is situated, unquote. So the gradual extension of the vote to white men without property eventually, former slaves, and even eventually women, has changed things somewhat. More people are involved, but the fundamental dynamic that only an elite few can win elections, people who are well known, who have access to connections, money, etc., can actually govern, leaving the bulk of the population as subjects rather than rulers. So today, we have to ask what sort of people seek elections in terms of their psychology and their class makeup. More likely, they're going to be overconfident, sociopaths, and narcissists. Not all of them. Some of them are wonderful people, very well motivated. But the point is, it's not representative of the population, and that there are an inordinate number of narcissists. And they're overly sure of themselves and their views. And there's been a lot of studies that show that people who have this confirmation bias and an illusion of knowledge are ill-suited to doing real deliberation. And the partisanship that's inherent in elections means that people in these bodies basically never deliberate. What is referred to as debate is actually a performance art. It's showing why they are right and the other side, the other parties, are either foolish or evil and need to be defeated in the next election. I was a politician. I know what goes on in these chambers. It's all show. When there is something like deliberation, it's amongst like-minded people in the same party who, or with lobbyists, they're invited sometimes too. But there is no diversity. There's no real comparison of conflicting views. It's a bunch of people who agree with each other working out the details of the bill. There's also, in addition to partisanship, there's a whole issue of agenda setting. Politicians largely set the agenda based on what is useful for the next election cycle. And like Sparta, which was not referred to as a democracy in ancient Greece, they had elections. They let the popular people vote in an assembly, but they decided the agenda. They decided what issues the people got to vote on. And essentially, it's the same thing here. Politicians are setting the agenda. Murray Edelman, a political scientist who I really admired, He passed away several years ago. He explained in his book called Constructing the Political Spectacle, I'm going to quote, he says, "Perhaps the most powerful influence of news, talk, and writing about problems is the immunity from notice and criticism they grant to damaging conditions that are not on the list." In other words, agenda setting, it's not just what is on the list, it's what is excluded from the list. An Austrian sociologist, Manfred Prisching, wrote, "Politicians know the rules for creating audience attentiveness, as media personnel know how to create permanent stream of impressive news," in quotes. "There is a common logic for both partners in this game. They cooperate in producing symbolic politics, pseudo events, political entertainment. A world of simulacra is produced. The fictitious world becomes the real world, and reality is dwarfed by the staged events." So congressional committees in the United States, for example, back in the 1980s, received urgent warning from NASA and other scientists that greenhouse gases were already changing the climate, and that by the first half of the 21st century, there could be cataclysmic effects. Now, the problem was this was not a good campaign issue. This was something that if they had moved forward with, dealing with fossil fuels, they would be afraid they would lose the next election, because looking that far down the road just wasn't something that politicians are able to do, generally speaking. Wait until an issue is so essential that they can't avoid it. And once politicians are elected, as I said, they don't really engage in deliberation. They're in a bubble of partisan agreement. And there, of course, the polarization that politics and politicians is their lifeblood of electoral politics infects the rest of society. And some division within society is natural and inevitable. There are real class differences and other differences, but this partisan feuding infects the rest of society with leaders because fear is a successful campaign motivator. And so, oops, I'm going to just hang up that phone. Yeah. So the question is, what are the benefits of elections, or what are the supposed benefits? Well, one assumption many people have is that, well, it brings expertise. Ordinary people can't possibly, it's so complicated. We need politicians as experts. And the fact is, keep hanging up that phone. Accountability. So the fact is that politicians don't bring any expertise to the table. The skills needed to win elections are not the skills needed for governing. And the drafting of legislation, that's done by staff. That's not done by other interests, politicians. The expertise is an illusion. Then there's the issue of accountability. People assume that, well, elections hold politicians accountable. In fact, they don't. There's, due to rational ignorance, the fact that one vote has very little chance of making an impact, people do not spend the time to monitor their elected officials. In fact, they know almost nothing about what their elected officials do on issues of corruption. Due to the allure of power, elections are more likely to elevate more corruptible narcissists who then are enticed to resort to more corruption to maintain the concentrate power. In the United States, actually, it's been shown that several studies that an elected politician in Congress, for example, is more likely to die in office than lose a primary election. In other words, elections do not remove people for cause. However, they do occasionally remove politicians. There's this wonderful book called Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government by Christopher Aachen and Larry Bartels of Princeton and Vanderbilt universities. And they give a couple of really wonderful examples. One is the Great Depression, where a global depression caused the incumbents to be thrown out of office all over the world. And in countries governed by left-wing governments, they were replaced by right-wing governments. Places that were governed by left-wing governments, they were replaced by right-wing governments. In other words, they threw the bums out who had no control over the global depression and replaced them. But it can't really be called accountability. But the even better example, I think, is they used the example in the early part of the 20th century. There was a spate of shark attacks on the New Jersey shoreline, and the tourist communities right on the shore saw a huge drop in their business, and the economy in the communities right along the shore were devastated by the effects of the shark attacks. And they found that the neighborhoods right along the shore voted against all the incumbents in the next election. Now, they weren't responsible for the shark attacks, but when things go bad, you throw the bums out. So the idea that elections give people a voice, it's de minimis because of it's a drop in the bucket. It's not really there. It's a show. And one last example I'll give in this before I go on to talking about the transition to a sortition democracy is, while many people vote based on party, there are some people who vote based on individual candidates. And there's this really interesting series of studies that has been replicated many times, where they took photographs of politicians and presented them to people from other countries, including children, and asked them which of these faces of people who are opposing each other in an election seems more competent or more honest. And they showed them the photograph for less than 1 second each. And both the children and the adults in these other countries who knew nothing about any of these candidates, they ended up picking the photograph of the candidate who actually won the election about 70% of the time. And this was replicated with people in Switzerland looking at photographs of people in France, people in the United States looking at photographs of people running for election in Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So this cannot be by chance. You would expect at most 50%, but it was an overwhelming majority picked the candidate who won the election, which means that many voters are voting on unconscious basis, not based on policy. Even if many people are voting based on policy and based on party label, enough people are voting based on whim, if you will, that elections basically cannot be used as a means of accountability. So I'm going to wrap up shortly here, and then we can have some discussion. My argument is that for the short term, we obviously need a lot of citizens' assemblies of the sort that have been going on around the world, because people need to see them, they need to be aware of the alternative, and these are almost, with a few exceptions, these are advisory bodies. But at least they serve an important educational function that people see. Ordinary people can tackle really complex issues. Often they can even come to consensus. But my notion is that this only works so far because the issues that politicians have basically allowed them to tackle are issues that the politicians have not taken for themselves, issues that the politicians haven't tackled themselves at all, or where there's no partisan agreement. There are exceptions, but by and large, their sortition assemblies have been on the periphery of public policy making. Down the road, if we want sortition democracy to become more meaningful, eventually they're going to have to be tackling issues where the politicians have platform positions. And the idea that we might someday have, for example, one assembly that's elected and one chamber that's selected by lot, I don't think that really works, because at some point, the two bodies would either butt heads because they disagree, or the allotted chamber of amateurs would be manipulated by the political professionals, and they would be asked to join partisan, interest groups within the allotted chamber and so on. But if they ever do actually butt heads, there's one group which is temporary amateurs who will be gone shortly, and there's another chamber of professionals whose careers are on the line, who are experts at public relations. And they're just going to say, if they disagree with the allotted chamber, do you want a bunch of hairdressers and ditch deekers deciding these issues, or do you want us to decide, the people you voted for and empowered to deal with these issues? So I believe a mixed system, whether it's within one chamber or two separate chambers, is not ultimately a good strategy to move forward. And then I'm going to talk briefly about my preferred transition strategy. My idea is to, what I call peeling, is to move away one policy domain at a time from the elected bodies to sortition process. For example, you might transfer issues of public transportation, take that completely, or maybe healthcare, completely out of the elected legislature. They are no longer going to deal with those issues. Those issues will be decided by a sortition process. And my notion is that that would be successful enough. People would say, hey, they're doing a good job, that anytime in the future where there's a crisis of corruption or some issue that goes astray by the politicians, people say, let's take that issue away from the politicians also. So my idea is to, the process that I refer to as peeling. Now, it's not the only way to move forward, but it's one way which I believe could be very effective. I basically want to avoid a bicameral system or trying to create a full power allotted assembly. I think that, and many of you have heard my paper on multi-body sortition. It's important that the sortition bodies rotate, that people not be in there for extended periods of time. That just leads to corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these are points that are in my book, and I go through a lot more, obviously. And I'm going to post in the chat in a few moments after we start discussion, the links. One is the link to the Substack in Democracy Creative, where you can subscribe to the book if you haven't already, and get all the past posts, and also get weekly emails with the rest of the book that's left to come. I'll also post links to my multi-body sortition paper and my paper on why hybrid bicameralism is, I think, a mistake. So I will be posting those in the chat in a few moments. And there, I think I will pause, and we can start with discussion and questions and answers.
Does anyone have a question or comment?
I don't mind going first. So many questions. This is such great work, Terry. Why don't I start with something, probably the most challenging thing in my head at the moment. People who try to support elections often argue that they confer the greatest legitimacy. You know, especially in Australia, where I'm from, which is, you know, really high rates of voting, around 95%. They say nothing confers legitimacy like that. And in comparison, your, you know, sub 100 mini publics don't have a legitimacy, both at the almost theoretical level, and they don't have the legitimacy to the wider population. I've got a response to that, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Well, that's a really challenging one. The reason elections have legitimacy is because they've been around so long. It's, you know, like in elections, a lot of people say, at least in the United States, which doesn't have ranked choice voting or proportional representation, a lot of people have voted against their representative. They voted the other way, and they're still told that, well, that is your representative, even though they disagree with you on everything. That's your representative, and they have legitimacy because they won the election. And people say, well, okay, they have legitimacy, and it's like, it's a custom, it's a tradition. If you voted against them, why should you consider them your representative? There are in countries with proportional representation, it's different probably, but yes, I think there is legitimacy that's earned through election. My argument is that greater legitimacy could be achieved by people who understand the process of random sampling and scientific sampling. This body, the famous quote from John Adams in 1776, he wrote that an ideal legislature should be a portrait of the people in miniature. It should think, reason, and act like the people. And the idea is that a random sample can actually do that. A group of people who, like in the United States, Congress the majority of them are millionaires. They are not representative of the people in terms of who they are, descriptive representative. Are they representative in terms of policy? Polling shows that they aren't. The issues that most people want to have done, they want universal health care, they want jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Congress does not do those things. So they don't have legitimacy based on issues, on descriptive representativeness in terms of who they are, but they have legitimacy based on the tradition. And I believe that the more citizens' assemblies that exist, the more people see them doing good work, they will earn the legitimacy that they deserve. I don't really have an end run or a magic silver bullet that's going to solve that. It is a real conundrum. It is a challenge.
That's pretty much what I'd say. And the only other thing I'd add is maybe they need to make a rap musical which was about someone other than Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, who thought the president should be elected for life like a king.
Yeah. Thorsten has his hand up. And Terry, if you could please put the link to the multi-body sortition paper in the chat. I would, for everyone here, if you haven't read that, I would strongly recommend it.
That's in the chat now.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thorsten, and then Tristan.
Yes, thank you, Terry, for your presentation and the new book. I really love to read it, but what I'm missing is a more popular way to public relations on sortition, maybe some short explanatory videos, for example, engaging some influencers or find some important people who speak out for sortition and explain a system, an alternative to electoral democracy. There are only papers and books, but nothing very popular or easy to understand.
Yeah, I do not disagree. I took on a particular task because it was interesting to me. I agree that what is needed desperately is the more populist arguments. And there are people who are working that, like Adam Cronkite, who's a member of Democracy R&D. He's been working for like a year on this documentary he wants to make. His organization, I call it Of, By, For the People or something like that. And because his whole thing, it's not about working with the politicians. His whole angle is it's about creating the demand from below. And that definitely is where the movement is weakest. But we need to do all those things. You know, facilitators who are running citizens' assemblies, God bless them. I don't think I'm competent at that, but I'm so thankful that people are doing that, because people will never demand a reform if they've never seen it before. So we need to be doing those. But you're right. You're absolutely right. What we need is more populist elevator pitches, as they're called, short, pithy, to the point. And I will say that I have given presentations across the political spectrum. I've spoken to right-wing libertarian groups about sortition, and they end up all nodding their head, because almost across the board, people agree that politicians are the problem, regardless of their perspective. And there's this one key element to sortition that I love, which is that most people who are politically minded believe that if they could get a room of ordinary people together and explain things to them as they understand them, they've studied this, if they could just explain it to them, they'd agree with me. And they could be a right-wing capitalist libertarian or a left-wing Marxist. They all think that they figured it out, and ordinary people would agree with them if they could just explain it. And that is why sortition has the potential to appeal to people across the political spectrum, because of that bias that we all have, that our way of thinking is convincible because it's the right one.
Tristan is next, and I also just posted the link to the multi-body sortition article in the chat. Tristan.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, David. First of all, I want to thank Terrill for his very interesting input. I have two questions. The first one is about the model of sortition you're thinking of, because so far, at least here in Germany, also on the European level, we do not really force people to come to the citizen assembly. So you get a letter, you get a phone call, and then it's up to you to say yes or no. So there is a certain level of self-selection. You can try to mitigate that effect by approaching people, I don't know, in their everyday environment, for example, and really try to get those people that you selected to get to the assembly, but eventually it's their choice.
Yeah.
And a second question.
Wait a minute.
I have a second question, if I may. The second question is, it pertains to your transition strategy. And it's a pretty simple question. Why should politicians agree to giving up their power?
So for the first one, in my multi-body sortition paper, I talk about different bodies. The body that drafts a proposal from raw materials submitted by lobbyists, interest groups, ordinary citizens, all the input would come from wherever in the society. And then a random body like the citizens' assemblies that have existed in recent decades could work that through, combine pieces of different organizations' proposals and prepare a final draft. My idea is that then a final jury, a much larger statistically representative jury, ultimately with compulsory service, like jury duty in the United States. You can get out of it for certain, I just gave birth to a baby, I can't go to jury now. There are reasons you can be excused. But ultimately, we need the final yes-no decision by a jury that hears all the pro and con arguments after some education. They vote yes or no on whether this is going to be a new law. I agree. Having too much self-selection is a very bad problem. That's why I have this constant argument with people like Marcin in Poland. He thinks that the body that he's put together, they've done all this learning. Ultimately they should be able to make a decision. And I say, nope, they should never make a decision because there's always the risk of groupthink. There's the risk of deferring to high status members. There's the risk of, even if you do stratified sampling, you have people who are of a particular ilk. And so my idea is the final authority needs to be in a randomly selected group that ultimately it has mandatory service. We're not there. We can't do that right now because none of the citizens' assemblies that we're organizing have the authority to compel attendance, right? So we can't do that right now. But that is the goal that I aim towards. Oh, and what was your second one was, why would politicians give things up? There are some issues where politicians have a clear conflict of interest we could start with. For example, ethics enforcement. Politicians right now write their own ethics rules and then they have a panel that enforces them. And almost everybody, including politicians, acknowledge that it's built-in conflict of interest. So there's some issues where they will be embarrassed to defend keeping that power. Then there's some other issues which are lose-lose issues for the politicians, no matter which way they decide. For example, in Ireland, with same-sex marriage or abortion rights, the politicians, they were happy to give that issue away because they didn't want to take a stand and have either the pro-abortion or anti-abortion groups coming after them in the next election. So there will be some issues where politicians are willing to give up power. Also, there will be occasions where there's a corruption scandal and they're embarrassed to hold on to it, where they've done something horrible. In the United States, I could cast back to there was a savings and loan debacle that cost the taxpayers many, many hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts. And the Democrats and Republicans both were equally culpable. If people had known about sortition back then, they could not have resisted giving over regulation of the economy to a sortition body. So we grab when we can. Other questions or other comments, disagreements?
I have another one if it's okay. So what do you think is more important, which is creating a false dichotomy from the start, but is it deliberation or random selection? Like, for example, if I was setting up a like a civic program. And the main thing I wanted to do was just get people out there deliberating, even if they were self-selected, even if, they weren't very representative of the population. Is that a positive step, or do we really need to show people the total package? Because and maybe that leads to a secondary question, which is, do you believe that the strength of what you're proposing is the total package of sortition and deliberation?
Yes, I agree. I think what I'm proposing is the total package. In that, I believe both are really, really valuable, but neither one by itself is sufficient. You could randomly select people. Well, there are tasks which random selection can be done with virtually no deliberative process, and it can still be very democratic and very beneficial. I like to use the example of, what if every mayor was reviewed by a randomly selected panel once a year, that a large jury was pulled together. They could listen to complaints from all over the community about the mayor. They could listen to arguments supporting the mayor, and without any trying to craft a proposal or trying to deliberate on the pros and cons of arguments of about policy, they could simply vote to remove the mayor. People who are actually well informed, because the fact is, due to rational ignorance, almost all voters have very little firsthand information about any politician. It's based on public relations campaigns, through et cetera, word of mouth. Because of rational ignorance, politicians basically get a free ride. They get no real evaluation. So you could use random selection for things that are not fundamentally deliberative. However, just relying on deliberation by itself is a very misguided strategy as well. First off, they don't have no legitimacy to make a final decision because they're not representative of the community. So they can craft things, but if you just then pass it on to politicians, they'll just ignore it if they don't like it, or if they like it, they'll adopt it and use the deliberative process as a fig leaf to pretend that they were listening to the people. I mean, politicians do that all the time. When a politician wins an election, they assert, the people have spoken. All the things that I believe have been ratified by the electorate. It's nonsense, right? But so the same thing would happen with a deliberative process. If you have it, the politicians would take the things that they liked and say they have been ratified by the people, and ignore the things that they dislike. So the deliberative process by itself is toothless and is potentially dangerous. However, if it's combined with a jury that is genuinely representative, then assessing it and saying yes or no, then a diverse group of people, even if it's not fully representative of the population, as long as it's got a lot of diversity, they can craft things that politicians would never consider. And presenting those things, a deliberative process might find win-win options. As a politician, when I was a politician, when a bill would come forward from the opposition parties, my first task was to figure out what was in that bill that I could attack to prove that it represented the evil or foolishness of the other parties for the next election. I had no interest in looking for win-wins or common ground. That's not the job of a politician. In a sortition body, randomly selected, even if it's not fully representative, that is their task. What can we agree on? Where is the common ground? And so that is very, very valuable, and it's completely missing in our electoral chambers. So deliberation has a lot of value, but deliberation amongst unrepresentative groups by itself can be detrimental.
Thank you. Anja, thank you for coming. Good to see you. And I strongly recommend the multi-body sortition paper. It has affected how I understand democracy tremendously, and it was a big influence on Oost-Belgium and later on Paris through David van Reybrouck's book.
already shared with the team. Thank you
Oh,
so
very
much.
good.
Thanks, Terrill.
Great. Good to see you. Anna, Joe, Kunal, do you have any questions or any comments?
No, as of now, David. I'm just following the discussion, trying to understand things. Yeah.
I've got another one, if it's okay.
Go for it.
You published in a relatively unique way through Substack in progressively. Like, what was that like? Was that a good way? Was it a good way to generate the book? Did you get, anyway, why did you do it that way?
This is very interesting. I started writing this book more than 10 years ago, and it evolved over that time. And I started trying to find a publisher. And in the United States, not a single editor had ever heard of sortition. It's so unknown in the United States that it just didn't make any sense to anybody. I got a couple of nibbles from a couple of publishers, and I couldn't find what do you call them? The person who helps you get a publisher. Anyway,
Agent.
An agent. I couldn't get a literary agent to take the book because, quite frankly, they didn't think it was going to be lucrative to them to try and get a book that seemed kind of like off the deep end. Now, if I were writing it, I tried to get like David Van Rijbroek, which uses a lot of my research in his final chapter. So I talked to his publisher, said, "Oh no, we already did a book on that." It's like, so I had this book and I shopped it around to publishers for many years. So finally, I decided, well, I'm just going to start releasing it because this is good stuff. I think there's a lot of people who could benefit, and maybe down the road, I will find a publisher and we can get it printed as a paper book that sells on Amazon and in bookstores. And I even have, the option of self-publishing, and there are people who are interested in doing that with me. And quite frankly, this process of going back and reading chapters that I wrote like 8 years ago, like, oh, that's a really good point. Oh, look at that. Oh, I forgot about that. It's been very gratifying for me to go back and do some revision, add some more current information, and go through the whole process. So it's an editing process as well for the final book. And so it's been I've been doing this. I've been releasing posts for over 1 year now. And I'm at post, 70 something. And so it's a little bit more than one a week. And so this was the process by exclusion from the publishing world. This is my end run, but I still want to get into the publishing. I still want to have a paper book that I can hold in my hand, and I want to have people be able to find it on Amazon and other bookstores.
Thorsten.
Yes, my question would have been if the book would be published in other languages, but what you told, the chance is very low.
There is two French people, one in Canada and one in France, who have asked permission to translate my book as it goes along. They did do a few chapters. I don't think they've persisted, and I don't know where they have it posted online. And I believe there was somebody who was going to start doing it in German, and I don't know if he even did one chapter. But I would love to have it. I give carte blanche to anybody who's a competent translator to put it in any language they want. I'm not planning to make any money from this book at all. The idea is to get it as widely distributed as possible.
I would suggest that you post a request on the Democracy R&D member forum about translation. It would not surprise me at all if a few people popped up and said, "Oh yeah, I'd be interested in helping to translate that into Spanish or Portuguese or Japanese or Korean."
Yeah, in fact, Portuguese was one of the languages where somebody else approached me about that one too. I don't think anything happened on that one either, but he got permission from me. All I need is a little statement. The final version of the translation has not been, affirmed by the author. As long as it says that, people can have at it. But yeah, that's a good idea, David.
You may want to present it as an opportunity for someone in a university who's got a class of students to say, right, everyone in the class, you're going to pick one chapter, you're going to translate it, and you're going to teach it to everyone. We're going to critically engage with this material through the translation.
Good idea. And one other thing I will mention while people think if they have any last questions is, I am seeking feedback. A few people, there's a comment section in each one of my posts. People can send comments, and sometimes people just send me a thumbs up and say, this was a really good chapter. And there are a couple of people who keep saying, you have a typographic error on line 27, but things like that. But one of the things I'm particularly looking for is, and I got one comment just recently, which is really good. It says, this chapter didn't tackle these issues. I assumed it would, and it really needs to tackle these issues about accountability of sortition and so on and so forth. So comments about things that are too tangential, and I'm just like, foaming at the mouth with things that are really off the topic, or things that are really wonderful and really need to be expanded. So those kinds of comments on any of my posts are also welcome, as well as typographic errors.
So is that the main way we can assist you at the moment, by literally engaging with the book via the Substack?
Yeah, and getting as many people and suggesting it to your own personal lists of people saying, oh, I'm reading this book, it's really, really interesting, you should check it out. Just spreading the subscriptions broader. This is free.
Again, I would suggest you post something in requests in the member forum. Hey, really looking for feedback on this book. You can do, especially, things like XYZ. You can find it here.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions or comments? Well, I would like to thank you all for coming, and want to thank Terry. And I will make the recording available. I'll post it to the network.
All right, nice to see you all.
Good to see you as well.
All right, bye-bye.
Great work,
Bye-bye.
Great work, Terry. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.